Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, You Shall Have No Other Gods, the book of Exodus. Today we'll be talking about the first chapter of the book of Exodus. Here we begin our study of the book of Exodus. The name Exodus means road out, and this book describes the journey of the people of the sons of descendants of Israel out of Egypt toward, but not quite to, where they're going to land. It's all that journey. That's the what, and that's the easy part. Beyond that, as they're journeying out of Egypt, the book is metaphorically a depiction of their journey to start to become the people of God. And separately, a depiction of the person of Moses, who personally undergoes a similar but better journey, right? We see these are people who have lost most of their connection to God, right? The connection to God was, as God is named, a connection with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. We never really saw the other brothers really super on board with the message, right? In fact, we saw something to the contrary. And their descendants likewise, maybe, and if their parents weren't that great into it, then how well were they going to do, right? And then they all got into Egypt, and time has passed, and generations have passed, and it's not only the Egyptians who have forgotten what was. There's some but very little difference at this point, and we'll talk about it, but between the Israelites and the Egyptians, as there's very little difference between Moses as an Israelite and an Egyptian, right? He's both. And he's not so much somebody who knows and follows and serves God. He's a great representative of the people because he's gone as far astray as they have. The difference is Moses undergoes a very complete and fairly quick, to his credit, conversion. And it transforms him overwhelmingly. And he tries to drag the rest of these people along with him to a lesser degree of success. There's so much important there, right? In terms of how one person's relationship with God can shape that of many, many other people. He puts structures in place to try to help lead these people toward God that become the foundation of their identity as people of God, right? Going into this point, what they have and are still maintaining is circumcision. He gives them new things that are, for all of its symbolic value, circumcision doesn't do that much to keep someone following and serving God. For any number of reasons, including it only happens once and only to roughly half of people. It's not a really great thing to build a religious practice around in an ongoing way, which explains some of why they fell away. It's important for carving out some of that ethnic identity, pun not intended, but we'll leave it there, it fits. It's important for establishing some of that ethnic identity, but it's not, let's say it is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for people to be for these people to be the people of God, right? Which is to say, for those who aren't super familiar with philosophy concepts, you have to have circumcision for them to be the people of God. But it's not enough by itself to create what that is. So Moses puts in place new structures that are able to, or are intended to be able to, bridge some of the gap of what was lacking in circumcision. So as these people are taking a journey out of Egypt, they're taking a journey into what it means to become the people of God and how they do that. And it's in the form of a conversion experience, and it's led by Moses, the prophet. So that is the journey that we will be taking with these people. Also, by way of introduction, a few notes about, the book and its context in history and all of that, because it's hard to study this without some of that coming up. The first 5 books of the Bible, tradition describes as the books of Moses, and were for a long time attributed to Moses from the point of view of authorship. We see at the end of the books of Moses, at the end of Deuteronomy, we see one of the biggest challenges to that notion when Moses dies and there's still a little bit more book that he definitely didn't write. Beyond that, and it matters not terribly much for the purpose of this Bible study. We're just getting it out there because it's useful to have a vague notion, and it will matter here and there in how we talk about a couple of things. There's a very prevailing idea among biblical scholars that different people wrote different parts of these 5 books at different times for different reasons, and that they were ultimately all compiled together into the books that we have now. That explains a lot of things that happen in these earlier books, including one of the things that led to that realization is how God is referred to. Different words for God are used in different parts of these books, and there are different groups of people who would have called him different things, such as Yahweh or Lord or Elohim. And there's no contextual reason for any of that difference, but there could be reasons based on authorship and agenda. And things like that, or things like there being 2 different accounts of creation that are told from wildly different points of view that seem hard to believe were written by the same person. And other similar occurrences of the same event being told from different points of view, with overlapping and sometimes contradictory details. Those are the sorts of things that lead people to form the conclusion that this makes more sense if there's more than one author. So from a scholarly point of view, that is the prevailing theory or hypothesis. From a faith point of view, you don't have to believe that. And from this Bible study point of view, it doesn't matter that much. There will be a few places in the book of Exodus. There's a lot less of this in Exodus than in Genesis. But there are a few places in the book of Exodus where that idea helps provide some interpretive color to why we might have different versions of a similar sequence of events that we'll probably, at least in the videos, reference back to and say, hey, here's an example of where that might be a thing and how that can help us understand what's going on here. So there will be a couple of those instances, not a lot. And again, you're welcome to say, no, Moses wrote it, so that doesn't, I don't buy that, and that's fine. And that is totally fine. But it's out there, and so you're aware it's out there. Around that, one of the biggest objections, I think, to that idea is, and this ties in with the second point about the text I'm going to make as well, is then this can't be true, right? If it's not written by Moses and the tradition around it and the historicity of it, which is the other thing we'll introduce, isn't maybe as real as Exodus suggests in every place, then it can't be true, right? Because it's what it's talking about didn't happen exactly. It contradicts itself, and what it's talking about maybe didn't happen exactly the way it talks about it. Then we have to throw the whole thing out, and that's a definitely not. I'm not going to go through like the whole of that in this intro, because it's a fairly lengthy conversation, and we did it in the video intro to Genesis. So for the idea about truth and how it relates to the historicity of factuality of something we read in the Bible and reconciling those two concepts, if you're struggling with that, and you want more, watch the introduction to the book of Genesis. If you're not struggling with that, maybe watch it anyway. It's really good, but you don't need to for this. So that leads us then very naturally to the idea of, did these things happen? And the next key point there, along with the idea of authorship, is it doesn't matter that much. And so everything else I'm about to say about whether I think it happened or not is secondary to the idea of it doesn't matter that much, either to this Bible study or to our faith, right? Like what matters is the larger truth about God and his relationship to his people that is conveyed by this. And as long as we read it from that point of view, it's not overwhelmingly essential whether this happened as it's written or not. So we're starting there. Second point is the book of Exodus describes a number of events in Egypt that had very large magnitude in terms of what happens and what would have radically shifted the culture and civilization of Egypt if things had happened as described. If the plagues had happened, if the destruction of the army had happened, if they'd lost that many of their key workforce all at once, these things would have had massive rippling effects on the culture and civilization of Egypt. And it is very likely that there would be better and clearer written record outside of the book of Exodus if they happened entirely as described. So again, it is generally seen as doubtful from an historical point of view that all of these things happened as described in the book of Exodus. If it's true that these things were written down long after the fact, it's also the case then that they're imbued with a lot of that later meaning and context from between when they happened and when they're ultimately being written down. And it bears the weight of these sort of like how did you meet stories that we have in our own relationships that grow and expand over time. It's the way God gets to know these people and these people get to know God in a relational sense is very important. And becomes important in the book of Exodus to who God is, right? He's been the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, and he had that direct relationship with those three and with Joseph. All right, they got to know him, and in a way, he got to know them, right? He created them, he knows everything about them. But from a relational point of view, God had a relationship with 4 guys, and now he's coming to have a relationship with Moses as well. It's so important to what's happening in the book of Exodus that relationship is expanding. And it's important to figuring out what's going on in the book of Exodus to know that there's a little bit of an issue with the idea that God's relationship with his people was through these guys who are now dead. And they're not there anymore. And what do you do about that, right? So God's relationship with Abraham, obviously great. And allowed Abraham to become the father of the faith and the one who kicks this whole thing off. But then I'm some guy in the tribe of whatever, one of the ones that you don't hear as much about, like a long time after Abraham is dead, what's my relationship with God look like? Who is he? He's the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Awesome. What does that mean to me then? And so we need to get from God had a relationship with these few guys to how does God have a relationship with his people? And how do I, as an individual person in those tribes, come to have that relationship? And then ultimately, how do we now do that, which is a broader thing still through the mediation of Jesus Christ. It's a whole different thing even than the covenant mediated by Moses. And it goes in phases and parts. But for now, it's useful to understand that these sorts of stories and some of the details of these things can definitely grow over time, and the history of where they end up can color and change the perception of events that, if told as they were happening, might seem very mundane. You will be my God, I will be your God, and you will be my people, is a foundational idea here. And as they have become God's people, this meeting and the events that lead it to happen take on so much weight in the history of these people. And everything references back to this. It is essential, this sequence of how they met. That there was crisis in Egypt, God delivered them mightily from that crisis, led them through peril and wandering, and brought them safely into the promised land, guided by Moses, who gave them these rules, laws, and to follow, and this priesthood to carry out, continuing to be an intermediary between the people and God. These are all surely in some capacity true and essential things. The exact character of how they happened may have been overblown a little bit by time, but as we read it, the important thing that we're reading for is, what was the takeaway of these people about how this thing started and what God means to them? God means to them, as this is being written down, 10 massive plagues carried out against Egypt. God single-handedly overwhelming and destroying all of Pharaoh's armies. The firstborn for all generations being subject to death and needing to, of humans and animals, being subject to death and needing to be bought back as things that belong to God and not to humans. There are core essential ideas here to the identity of what it means to be the people of God that are very true then, now, always. And those are the things we're going to focus on as we study the book of Exodus. So again, did this historically happen? Something did that inspired this. Did it happen this way? It's a little hard to buy that with the lack of other corroborating historical evidence, but it could have. Crazier things have happened, and God can do anything. It's possible that it happened exactly as written. And you are, as a Catholic, welcome to believe that. Most scholarship would doubt it. But scholars don't know everything. And that is a very human way of knowing things, and is limited by, as we try to look back many thousands of years, it's limited by what has survived, and is certainly a flawed and an incomplete way to look at things. So it can absolutely be wrong, the consensus opinion of scholars. It has and will be again in many, many ways. So you are welcome to be guided by faith to believe that these things happened exactly as written. You are welcome to not believe that. And again, I think for our purposes, it doesn't matter. And that's going to be where we land, as we did with Genesis. What matters is what this tells us about our relationship with God. And what it tells us about that is overwhelmingly true. And we will be focusing on and developing those true things about God and how we relate to him in the book of Exodus as we watch these descendants of Jacob become the people of God. Here in the book of Exodus, as we get started, we have a lot to do to lay a little bit of framework for how things are going. In large part because we're going to do a bit of a time warp from where we left off at the end of the book of Genesis. If you remember the end of the book of Genesis, and the text here is helping us do that, main characters, we had Jacob, renamed Israel, and sons, and there was a hullabaloo over jealousy about who was Jacob's favorite, and Joseph got sent off to Egypt, and God intervened, and Joseph did very well in Egypt, and eventually everybody followed. For now, here in this first question, we're remembering, hey, these sons of Jacob and families, 70 people, all in, the Israelites eventually came to Egypt following Joseph, who was already in Egypt. So in case you don't remember that happened, there were these people of God, sons of Jacob, who, as we know God right now, right? He is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And so he is only right now the God of any of these people insofar as they're descendants of Jacob, right? That's the extent of their relationship. So, but God comes, insofar as God travels, to Egypt with these people as they all journey into Egypt. And so we now have Israel, it's not a nation yet, it's 70 people. The extended family that is Israel is, as we left off, in Egypt. Now we move into things we didn't know. Joseph, well, pretty obvious Joseph eventually died, but we're moving forward in the story, right? So Joseph dies, as does that generation. And 70 becomes a lot more than 70. They multiply and grow in numbers. As we first hear that, we would assume, they're in with Joseph and the royal family, or Joseph is connected and has a good relationship with Pharaoh, and basically the king of Egypt, and he's really well established in a position of authority, basically number 2 in the country. His people come and they're multiplying greatly, which must mean things are going very well for the people of Israel in Egypt, right? It sure seems that way so far. The problem with having political relationships that the fate of you and your people are dependent upon are that the winds of change blow and political relationships change. More so now than back then, but if you're extending out several hundred years, just because Joseph and a pharaoh were close doesn't mean that, when that pharaoh dies, or even the next one or the next one does, that everybody's going to remember, hey, one of the guys related to these people back a long time ago really helped us out of jam. And that still matters somehow. No, that's not how kings think, right? Or politicians, or really anyone, right? Like us either, right? Like if you think, oh, God helped me out of a jam 10 years ago, so I should still be, devoutly serving him right now, we don't think that way either, right? Even and 10 years is really generous, right? 10 days is stretching it most of the time. 10 months is really stretching it. So it is not surprising that this happened. But that closeness that was based on a relationship between Joseph and Pharaoh inevitably over time dissolved, as neither Joseph nor Pharaoh were still around. So, new Pharaoh, new agenda, new opinion. Hey, look at all of these people who aren't Egyptians living in Egypt. That could be a problem. Xenophobia goes back a long ways, right? It's not necessarily they're taking our jobs so much as it is just we're worried about our identity as Egyptians, though, is a very real thing, right? Like, what's to stop Egypt from basically becoming Israel with so many Israelites here? And there seems to, for whatever reason, and we'll get into what that reason is because it's an important one, not be mingling, right? Like they haven't integrated, so you have like Egyptian Israelite mixed people. You still have, after all this time, two different ethnic groups, and that creates, as it always does, tension. The Egyptians are still in power, even though at this point the Israelites are growing in number, and Pharaoh looks at it and says, we could have a problem if we don't do something here. There are at least enough of them that if somebody else attacked us and we had to send the army away to deal with that, then they could, join the invaders and stir up enough trouble at home that it could compromise Egypt. And all of the other problems that could happen. Pharaoh decided we don't like these Israelites, right? They're not integrated, they're not equal. We need to do something about this ever-growing group of people living in our country who are not us. And since he doesn't know or care about the history of how they came to be there, or God, for that matter, or even Joseph, he has no great reason to respect their place. And so he is going to take steps to try to curtail any kind of ideas they have of being equal or assuming any kind of power or authority. Here, Pharaoh starts to carry out his plan, and that creates a very marked shift in how the Israelites are faring and what they're doing in the land of Egypt. At one point, we know they were not slaves. At another point, we'll see, they eventually are. This is the point at which that turns. To deal with the population, Pharaoh decides to oppress them in many ways and to put them at work, or to put them to work. It seems that right now, the Egyptians still had enough power to basically subjugate the Egyptians still had enough power to subjugate the Israelites living in Egypt. There were still more of them, and they had weapons and things, right? So they could they could say, you all are going to work and, do construction and manual labor for us. And that's what happened. And so this is that happening. And taskmasters were set. These people were enslaved. The idea of slaves and servants in the ancient world isn't necessarily the same as the idea. We have a bad history with these things in this country, right? Slavery in particular. And a servant now is not maybe what it was in the ancient world. And some of how we see slavery is certainly not how it worked everywhere in the ancient world. But it was some common threads there between some of the foundations of our country and the foundation of Egypt and what they did, and a whole lot of the foundation of Roman civilization were built on the labor of people who were not necessarily freely choosing to be doing that labor. How else they might have been treated and some of how else that went can vary a lot. Rome was generally pretty kind to their slaves. Our country was generally not. Egypt, generally, as we'll see, not. Like we see here, the idea isn't so much even, I want to get a bunch of free work out of these people, so much as I need to oppress them before they figure out that they could maybe have enough power that this could be Israel instead of Egypt. And no, we need to keep them busy. Let's have them do some work. I do think Pharaoh realizes later, it's really nice to have this free workforce. We would like to keep this going. It's working really well. But it seems like that wasn't the original motivation, and the oppression was just enough to keep them occupied, right? It wasn't meant to be horrible so much as it was meant to be, you all are just going to be focusing on work and not feeling like you have any choices in what you're doing, and certainly not having time or energy to think about overthrowing the government. And that was kind of the extent of what he was going for. We will see, as is the nature of oppressors, that relationship and how bad their slavery is kind of fluid, depending on how much they look like they might want to overthrow the government. Right? As long as they're not doing that, things are not that bad. The more they lean toward anything that looks like that, the more Pharaoh has to react. And that is the nature in every case of oppression, right? You can, as long as the oppressed people are happily being oppressed and doing, what you want them to, the burden of oppression can be fairly light. And then it gets less and less light the less comfortable they are being oppressed. And that's just the nature of it. So Pharaoh clearly has enough power to establish this oppression of these people. Makes a conscious decision to do so, and they go from being at one time free people in Egypt to being not that. The exact details of how that slavery works, we don't really know that much, but we do see some of the nature of the oppression, and that will become very important. So, all of a sudden, things not going so well for the Israelites in Egypt. But even though things are not going that well for them, they continue to be very fruitful, which is itself the thing that caused Pharaoh to worry. So if you're oppressing them and there continue to be more of them, that itself creates a point of tension for the oppressor. Because even so, a big free workforce, great, let's do that. An overwhelmingly giant free workforce, the logistics of oppressing them don't work, right? Imagine you have one Egyptian to 100 Israelites, right? Like, you can whip them all you want to and get on your chariot, you're just going to get overwhelmed. And they're going to decide they don't like being oppressed, and maybe you should be the ones building the pyramids. And there won't be anything you can do about it. 1-to-1, you have all the weapons, you probably still win. there's some point in between where they gain the ability to win, and there's some point after that where they realize that fact. And somewhere in there is your danger zone as an oppressive tyrant. And you've got to avoid getting to the danger zone. And so maybe you need to take, and oppression itself isn't curtailing the growth of the population, so you're going to have to figure something else out. More on the nature of the oppression and the slavery here, right? They're making them work really hard. Again, the idea being, maybe we can make you so tired and worn down that maybe you're not multiplying as much, and certainly you're not, sitting around talking about how to overthrow the government. And if you look like you're even thinking about that, then we can find more work for you to do until you don't look like you're thinking about that anymore. But by then we've normalized that you're doing all that work, so you're doing it anyway. What a great deal if you're in charge. So here we get to population control. There are still too many Israelites coming to be. What can we do about that? There's no great subtle plan here. There's no note that there's not hey, let's figure out how to intermingle our populations and make everyone stronger, right? That would be a good idea. But there seems to be some kind of ethnic or racial tension preventing that. It is unclear whether that is from the side of the Egyptians or the Israelites or both, but that doesn't seem to be treated as an option. That's definitely not treated as an option. We've got two separate groups of people and they're staying that way. So what are we going to do about that? We need there to be fewer Israelites. How do we do that? Well, we are just going to kill some of them when they're children and they can't do anything about it. Which ones are we going to kill? This is where I think ultimately Pharaoh maybe did have the idea of integrating the people. If you stop having any male Israelites and you still have female Israelites, then you can keep having a bunch of people. You can use the female Israelites to make more Egyptians then, right? So you can take advantage of this population that you have and you can integrate it into yours by getting rid of those pesky Israelite men, and you can just sort of weed it out. The issue with that is you also have this giant free workforce that is definitely the women aren't building pyramids, right? So you're having to kind of try to figure out towing a line here between which is more important, giant free slave workforce or looming threat of what that could lead to. And Pharaoh seems to be taking the position, I would rather weed all of them out and integrate and not have the slave labor than have the risk that comes with the slave labor. I think it's fairly important to understand that that's his end goal when we get to the tension that happens. He wasn't just trying to oppress these people and take advantage of their labor, though he was doing that in the short run. That was a short-term solution. He was trying to integrate and absorb these people and make them Egyptians. So anything that threatens to reinforce and solidify their identity as not Egyptians is going to be a huge threat to what it is that he's trying to do. It's easy to think about just the economics and the slavery side of this as, what he's afraid of losing. But I think it goes more deeply than that. He's trying to strengthen Egypt by absorbing these people into Egypt and make them Egyptians. And that, of course, involves necessary cultural assimilation, which includes worship of Egyptian gods, sending your kids to Egyptian schools, voting for Egyptian politicians, not that you get to vote. All of the things that, make somebody Egyptian, they need to do. And they're going to do that by cycling out the men, but he wants these people, and he wants them ultimately to be Egyptians. And so he wants to do things to compel them to be more Egyptian, including killing Israelite men. So that's the plan, and he's working with the Hebrew midwives because they delivered the Hebrew children, and he can threaten the lives of midwives. But it's interesting that he doesn't, with all of his oppressive authority, that there are still Hebrew midwives, right? He apparently doesn't think he can get rid of the Hebrew midwives and replace them with Egyptians that he could trust, or he's so sure of how well he's oppressing that he thinks it'll be fine to just tell the Hebrew midwives to do what he wants and they will participate in the genocide of their people. It is an interesting decision that he makes here, to think that he could just use Hebrew midwives to commit genocide against Hebrews. But that does seem to be what he thinks is going to happen. Then, both very predictably and also to the great credit of these midwives, they ignore what Pharaoh tells them, right? They are risking their own lives to do so, but they refuse to participate in the genocide of their people. Good job, midwives. And that's what God thinks as well. We'll get to that. So, but Pharaoh notices, hey, I'm seeing a lot of male Israelite babies here. I thought we were killing those. What's up, ladies? And they say, we're trying, Pharaoh. We're really trying to kill those babies, but we're just by the time we get there, they're already born, and the family's around, and then we can't really kill them. So we're trying, and we'll keep trying. But these darn Hebrew women are so strong and vigorous that they just keep delivering before we get there. But we're really trying, and we'll keep trying. It's a really kind of a baffling series of events, right? The idea that there must be a cultural thing there that even when Pharaoh feels like he can set these people against their will to work that they do not have any interest in doing and leverage that kind of control, he doesn't feel like he has the power and authority to directly interfere in a whole lot of reproductive issues, including the delivery of children. He's unable to, there's a line there that even as a tyrant, he doesn't feel able to cross without getting these midwives to betray their own people. It's a fascinating thing that is foreign in our culture, right? Our government has no problem feeling like they have every authority to step in and intervene in all kinds of reproductive issues, kind of any way they want to. But here, and that's in a democratic country where here a tyrant feels like that's off limits. That interesting food for thought and reflection for us all on how society is developed. Make of it what you will. But anyway, good for these Hebrew midwives, and they're willing to risk their lives to save the lives of Hebrew children. As I alluded to with some of the shorter text here, and it's easy to get ahead of myself. God really appreciates what the midwives do, and as a result, he gives them families, which also don't get murdered, apparently. And we see also, this idea that continuation of life, that large family is a blessing. So even when this is not the same thing, but we saw it with Jacob and with people in the book of Genesis with cattle, right? Like livestock. Like Jacob had just super good luck raising cows, right? And sheep. Like his father-in-law tried to keep giving him like the bad livestock, and he kept like figuring out ways to like, there was a great deal of multiplication and growth among herds that Jacob tended as well, right? And Abraham had rich and thriving, like that is part of the blessing of God, right? In Genesis, we saw it extend through one person. And they met with prosperity, and a part of that, because a lot of their wealth was in animals, was fecundity among the animals. Here we see whether the people are some of them clearly are somewhat devoutly serving God, right? And the example we get of anyone in these people keeping faithful to God is these midwives. And we see, as a result of that, that God is passing down to them the blessing of family. Through that, we see this blessing that was with one Israelite, last seen Israel, and then he sort of less clearly but distributed it among his sons in a way. We see that the people have inherited the blessing that was at one point with the one patriarch, whoever was active at the time. And here we see the first instance of the manifestation of that blessing being tied to behavior. The midwives are faithfully serving God, and so they are blessed. Before it was even something that could be by trickery stolen, and was good, like irrevocable, and like was good even though it was stolen, right? Like Jacob stole it from his brother Esau, and there's no like take backs, right? There's no, this isn't what was intended. There's no, you got it by immoral means, so it doesn't count. It was binding and good no matter what. Even maybe when it shouldn't have been, but God was also on board with it going to Jacob. Here we see conditionality on the blessing. It means a different, as it spread out and applies to all of the people, it manifests differently, and it's tied to behavior. That's new. That is a huge deal as we go from being a God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to a God of Israel, the people and not the man. You don't necessarily just end up super prosperous and well off and blessed because your parents were Israelites. There's some manner of having to serve God that brings you into that inheritance. And those are still the rules right now. We have blessing likewise of far greater abundance than this one available to us as Christians as well. Overwhelmingly greater blessing. But the same principle applies, right? We have to act like people of God in order to be blessed like people of God. It is a two-way street. This is the first time in the Bible that is true. and it's manifested through these two named midwives. The principle clearly is already established, but it's cool that we see it in action here, and it's really cool when the last three people who had the blessing were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that the next times we see it kicking in here are Sifrath and Puah, the midwives. So that's neat, and that rule change is going to be permanent. So to the extent possible here, Pharaoh is trying to not just work through the midwives now, right? He clearly gets that this isn't working that well. He commands all his people now. Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. So he's not just trying to get, this seems to be like anyone who runs across now a Hebrew baby boy, you are commanded to grab the baby boy and throw him into the Nile. That's an aggressive change. It's needed. I mean, clearly, if that's what he wants to do, having a couple of Hebrew midwives try to carry that out clearly isn't working very well. It's a big step. Pharaoh is kind of all in on this plan at this point, and he's really going for trying to integrate the Israelites into Egypt, and he's willing to involve a lot of people in committing genocide to do it. This has been an overview of Lesson 1 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. You shall have no other gods, the book of Exodus. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.